In the early parts of this year, in the before times, pre-pandemic shutdown, I needed a topic for a public-facing opinion piece for a class, and I started tracking news articles about Yoon Kim. Now, Kim is a Korean national female conductor, and at the end of the last year, so this is probably December, she was announced to be the next music director of the San Francisco Opera, and this is huge. At the time of the announcement, Kim was 29, which is unbelievable for a conductor. This job announcement is an incredible accomplishment for any conductor, let alone one at her age. So, as an opera fan and an Asian woman myself, I was really excited, and I thought this might be an interesting way or an interesting opportunity to look at how she was portrayed in the media for this opinion piece. Turns out it was just more than interesting. It basically sparked the project you're listening to now. I started tracking all of the announcements and noticing how some of these announcements fixated on how she was a female conductor, explicitly ignoring her wishes. And worst of all, sometimes her name wasn't even mentioned in the headlines, which I still find absolutely bizarre. And, you had to read into not just the first paragraph, but, probably the second or third to find what her name was. Mm-hmm. I started thinking about media portrayal and how this affects the artists that they're talking about. And even more importantly, how does gender bias fit into all of this?
Yeah, that paper, first of all, is amazing. But I can't believe that, first of all, it's been 9 months at this point, and it's developed into this whole project. Hi, my name is Frances Pollock.
I'm Allison Chu.
And you are listening to another episode of Miss Opera Music Mister, a podcast exploration of trends and biases in contemporary opera and how they reflect the world at large.
This podcast was developed out of a research project about gender bias in contemporary opera reviews, and we realized that the issues were much more interconnected and sprawling than we could explore in just one academic research paper. So, we turned to our friends, colleagues, mentors, and role models to help us out.
Welcome back to another episode of Miss Opera Music Mister. Today, I think it's a good opportunity to talk about all of the research that we've been doing behind the scenes that brought us to this podcast.
Yeah. And now that we've introduced ourselves and established some basic footing in the world of contemporary opera and talked to you about how important these reviews can be in our field, we now want to lay out what we're actually researching and how we're going about it.
I think it's probably also a smart idea considering we've been alluding to it in our introduction and haven't actually outlined what this research project is. So it's very true. So I think maybe let's give a little context. So last week we talked with Edwin and Joelle about how reviews contribute to an artist's career. Mm-hmm. From everything from publicity to legacy and opportunities. Affecting the artists' lives with mm-hmm. O1 visas.
Yeah. I mean, reviews are, this sort of deeply integral part of a composer's life, but they're also a big part of a scholar's life, right? I mean, critical history, critical reception is marked by these reviews.
Oh yeah, I mean it's in canon formation. It mm-hmm. It feeds directly into what does get written about and where does the research lie. A lot of times scholars will turn to reviews from that moment to see how this piece was received.
Yeah, totally. Well, and so our project became this centered around this one big question, which is how do reviews and identity, where do they meet? And more specifically, how do female opera composers get reviewed in major press? And how does that stack up to the reviews that our male counterparts get? And the reason that we chose the female and male dichotomy is because it maps very neatly onto the work that I do very specifically as a composer, mm-hmm. but also because we were hoping to set up a formula in which we could examine identity broadly, in inserting other identity markers.
And I think we were successful.
Yeah. We have been so far. We're still doing it.
Oh my gosh. It has been it is now, we're recording this in November and we started this project in March. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I still find it funny that this project was supposed to be a coffee that Frances and I were going to get, where we were just going to have a nice conversation, and instead this is okay, we're going to try and publish a research article on this incredible work, which blows my mind.
And we started a company around it.
This is a good opportunity to talk about how this project and podcast relate to the parent company Midnight Oil Collective. Late in the spring of 2020, while all of us artists were sitting at home after our industries collectively failed to pivot, Frances and I, along with a group of like-minded creators, were inspired to begin asking questions of our related fields. These questions were about sustainability. Why do artists live a lifestyle of poverty in arguably the most over-resourced country in the world? Why does the field have a hard time maintaining a diverse profile, despite art being a commodity that exists within every single culture and demographic across the country? And why are artists employed as contract labor, even though it is their art that builds the powerful institutions that we know and love? From those conversations came the Midnight Oil Collective, a production company and artist-led investment group that centers creators as primary shareholders. Our goal is to fight against the scarcity mindset and figure out a way to give artists agency and security while working on their art. Miss Opera Music Mister is just one of 5 projects that is being beta tested as part of Season 1. To learn more about Midnight Oil Collective's mission and vision, please feel free to visit us at midnightoilco.com.
So can you talk to me, Allison, more about, we've touched on this a little bit, but why is this important? Like, why is our research important? Let's lay it out. Like, why do we have grandiose ideas about this anyways?
I think this touches on just about every aspect of how this work gets received in the public eye. Mm-hmm. And I think this matters in terms of how, women composers get opportunities, how they get to build their careers, and then how does it go down in history? Mm-hmm. So if these pieces that women composers are writing are not receiving critical attention, it's likely that they'll just recede from cultural memory because they won't have the publicity to go and get further shows, mm-hmm. Further opportunities to be produced. And if no one writes about it, then see ya.
Then it's almost like it didn't even happen, right? Because there's nothing to market. So as a composer, I think about this sort of publicity all the time. I mean, it really impacts the way that I do my job, and I can market myself and I can sell myself not only as a composer, mm-hmm. But as someone who is important to perpetuating the field of the arts, right? Yeah. Which I mean, is kind of half the job these days, and probably has always been.
Yeah.
So a little bit more about our project. We are looking specifically at reviews.
Yeah.
Right?
Reviews, I think, are a really great way to gauge, attention and seeing how much critical attention is paid to certain specific pieces and specific composers.
Mm-hmm.
Especially because, in this day and age, now that, we're after the age of Me Too, there's a lot more attention paid on who is composing and where are these pieces getting produced.
Yeah. Who and what do the composers represent?
Yes.
So we're looking at reviews, and to analyze these reviews, we needed to figure out a model that would quantify some of the biases that we suspected were happening in print media.
Yeah.
Again, in our model, that's against women composers. But again, we're hoping to build a model that is not just about gender, but also allows for us to look for these biases in other identities. And to start this process, we compiled a long list of opera reviews from the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And broke them down by gender and by the budget of the opera house.
Yeah, so let's go into that, because that's a long list of parameters, and I think this is also why some of this work has taken so long. We've now gotten up to close to 80, I think maybe even a little bit over 80 articles, so 80 different reviews of different operas, contemporary operas, and that have been published in the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. So these reviews have to be focused on one contemporary opera. So nothing from the canon. No new crazy stagings of Wagner. No mm-hmm. Wagner in a parking garage. No Rigoletto in Vegas. That kind of thing.
Wagner in a parking garage sounds so loud. That would be so loud.
The review could only feature one opera, so we can't have 3 operas in one review. This happens frequently with festivals, mm-hmm. So we can't see, 3 different short operas in one review covering all of them.
Yeah, which has actually, we'll talk about that later, but that's actually been...
That's impacted our search quite a bit. So our reviews had to be from 2010 to 2020. Coincidentally, the pandemic has allowed us to get a really nice, clean cutoff which is unfortunate. But we've actually done also multiple reviews of this data mining because before we were looking at 30 years, and then we realized that most of the female composers were writing operas and I shouldn't say that, where those operas were actually being produced, and that was happening more around the early 2010s. So the majority of our articles were already from the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And we suspect this is probably because Beth Morrison jumped on the scene.
Francesca Zambello started to champion women composer. I mean, they've always been doing it, but, it became more prominent.
Yeah, and I mean also the those grants from the Opera America.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, the commissioning grant and the female discovery grant.
Yeah. So those came on the scene, and I think those really pushed the field and opened it up a little bit more.
Yeah.
And allowed for those opportunities. Okay, so the last parameter, the reviews all needed to be from major newspapers. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, San Francisco Chronicle, Chicago Tribune. Basically, we wanted to be sure that these were the major art sections whose reviews had some critical significance and following. We wanted to make sure that these were actually reviews that were getting read by the public. They wanted to know, what's on in New York City? Okay, New York Times has a feature on this thing. Cool, it looks great, let's go see it.
Yeah, totally. But as we started compiling these articles, we realized that it was much easier to find articles written about what was happening on the stages of the biggest opera houses. So we have a lot of reviews from the New York Times written about what's happening at the Metropolitan Opera. But what about the Brooklyn Academy of Music and where the theaters where a lot of these contemporary works were staged? Sometimes they got reviewed, but sometimes they didn't.
No, not at all.
And one of our biggest examples that we'll go into is a show like Prism.
Yeah.
That won the Pulitzer and got a review with the LA Times, but when it came to New York and did the Prototype Festival, it never got its own review.
Yeah, it was folded into that festival review, so it was tied in with 3 other, operas, which is great. It still got a review technically, but it doesn't fit our example. And I think we also should be clear about, we set that specific parameter to talk about focus. So if the article wasn't focusing on one opera, how much of critical attention can you really give to that piece?
Totally. Well, and we also, this is where we sort of ran into a little bit of a problem, because the reality, just the sheer reality of the Met, if a lot of these major reviews are happening in the New York Times about pieces that are happening at the Met's only ever staged 2 operas that were composed by women.
In the last 100 years.
Yeah. So that in and of itself became a barrier, I think, to how we compiled our data set.
Well, I also think it's interesting because of course they're going to review what's ever at the Met, because that's the biggest opera house in town, right? And then the decision comes to see what gets on, what is on the chopping block. What does the news section, which has a limited capacity, they have a few arts writers, where can they send their arts writers to what shows can they cover?
Right.
I think the question gets smaller and smaller the more you try and think about these smaller productions.
Yeah, totally. So
we broke these down by budget, because now we have 80 articles and it's just way too much data to figure out, and there's too much diversity and discrepancy between the production size. We're talking about Metropolitan Opera and we're talking about something as small as Brooklyn Academy of Music.
Yeah, I mean, smaller. Self-produced things,
yeah. The Here Art Center, something really, really small.
I mean, Here Art Center is still
big,
pretty big.
So we have to go even smaller than that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking that we have, I was thinking that Stinny is on there.
Yeah, Stinny's on there.
Was self-produced.
Yeah, so tiny.
Yeah.
Absolutely tiny. So in order to make the comparisons more fair, we broke them down into 2 categories. So we have Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 1 is made up of operas with annual operating budgets of over $20 million. So this is Met Opera, San Francisco Opera, Chicago Lyric. What a dream.
Yeah.
And Tier 2 is made up of all of the other smaller sized companies. And we're talking smaller size, but they're still with multi-million-dollar budgets.
Yeah.
So then we had to figure out a way to quantify our articles, but the fun thing is neither Frances nor I are statisticians.
No, so we needed help.
We needed lots of help.
We use this tool called VOYANT. It's a tool online that helps you break down your text into what appears most frequently, as well as the average article length by words. So that leads us to our title series, right?
Yeah, so that's where we got the title. In one of our various iterations before we cut down to this last 10 years, we found that actually the most frequently appearing words in the female composers category was Miss, Opera, Music, Mister.
Yeah.
Hence the title.
Which is interesting, right? Because in articles written about women composers, you would expect Miss, you would obviously expect opera, and you would expect music. But the fact that Mister is the fourth most used word in the reviews of operas by women is fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's also a style guide thing from the New York Times where they have to put Ms. and Mr. in front of the person's name,
Right.
which I think just opens us up to a whole lot of questions in our research. In particular, we looked at terms like music, opera, and gender identifiers. How often were female composers being identified as female? And why were female composers always identified as female, whereas male composers did not have the same qualifier in front of their occupation? And then, what about beyond composers? How did other collaborators factor into this? You know, thinking about the librettist, thinking about the conductor, thinking about the set designer. All of those people will be identified as well with Ms. or Mr. And that's going to contribute to our count of gender signifiers.
Yeah. And we're even beyond that, like, how were operas referred to? You know, were operatic works always referred to as operas? I mean, this kind of identification immediately associates a new work with a whole history of operas.
That word has a lot of baggage.
It has a lot of baggage. Historically, we might think of the 5-act grand opera with its elaborate sets and 100-person chorus. But what about something that, like what Beth Morrison does? You know, she has recently reclaimed the word opera in reference to small chamber operas, productions that can be done with just a handful of people. It's redefining what opera can be. So the designation of opera has a lot of importance. What does it stand up to, and what does it say about its continued evolution?
Yeah, I think it's particularly interesting to look at with reference to operas that are recently composed, right? Just thinking about, like, does an opera that is composed by a female composer and staged at one of the major opera houses, so we're talking tier 1 here, does that get referred to as an opera? Or does it get referred to as a piece of musical stage work, theater work?
Yeah. And what we have found that we will reveal later is that it depends on what level those composers are at often.
Yeah. We also wanted to see how often these composers received critical feedback. What sort of criticism did they receive? Were they compared to the works of canonical composers? Were they getting positive or negative reviews? And now, this part of the study is a little bit more subjective, but I think when you go through the reviews and you comb for those very specific references to the Western canon, those are undeniable. I mean, you have stuff like, this isn't Tosca. You know, you have an explicit, like,
Link to the Western canon.
Link to the Western canon, but not just link, but actually, like, negation of, you know, whereas other reviews you have basically direct comparisons where the new work is held up and said, oh, this is modeled after, this is inspired by.
This falls into the lineage of, you know, canonic composers. One of the other things that we were very clear about from the beginning of our study is that we're not concerned with the intentions of the critics. Like, overall, we think that the critics, you know, like most people in the arts, want to work towards gender parity.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing is an interesting phenomenon of critics advocating for one thing and their reviews reinforcing problematic
stereotypes, biases,
Yeah.
the sort of language that you don't really want to be associated with in the 21st century, I would say.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think they're, you know, actively trying to, you know, reinscribe the same sets of biases, right? I think
they're not.
No, I think they also have like a very impossible job of trying to pass judgment and write a piece that's charitable and yet also like critical towards these very new operas.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think the power of language matters here, right? You know, this is language that's being published to the public. You know, you're getting wide readership, and I think this is determining. It plays a role in determining the future of these pieces, and it plays a role in determining the future of these artists.
Yeah, absolutely.
What did you like about this project? What attracted to you about this project, Frances?
Well, so I had this sneaking suspicion that ever since I came up to Yale, in particular, where I started to really interact with people who were super active in this field, that the intention of the people who were acting in this field did not match the impact. So I very much got the impression that even though people were saying we really, really want for opera to diversify, that didn't actually happen. And that's still to a large degree not happening.
Yeah.
And so what attracted me to this project was I wanted to know why that was. And if there was something that people were doing that was ultimately working against their goal of diversifying the operatic field.
I think for me, this project was particularly interesting because it speaks directly to the cultural status of opera. You know, I mean, something as simple as looking to see when a work is referred to as an opera, when a review actually talks about the piece as an opera and not just a piece of theater or a piece of music, holds a lot of weight.
Yeah.
So I think, like, for me, the constant attraction to working on this project is going back and combing through these reviews and, like, actually reading them. I find reading them, even though it's, like, a document of 50 pages, I think it's fascinating to see, like, especially the references to the canon. It blows my mind every time I look at it.
Oh, yeah. Me too. And there is, like, when you put together enough reviews, you get the feeling that they are being handled differently with two different sets of gloves, you know?
Yeah.
And to me, that is bias, you know? And it could be bias coming from a good place, but it's still bias.
And the incredible thing is, like, this is tangible. It's not just like, oh, we have a sneaking suspicion and we're applying some hermeneutics to this, you know, process. It's like, no, actually, you know, women composers receive shorter reviews.
Right.
Period. And if their review space is being taken up by talking about how they are a woman composer and how, you know, they got to where they are because of X, Y, and Z grant and, like, congratulations to them on receiving X, Y, and Z commissions, then you're not actually paying attention to their work.
Right. You don't actually talk about the music.
No.
So, yeah. So, it's a way of confining the space to which women can be brilliant in the field.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it just feels to me like it's really on the ground and this work matters.
Yeah, totally. Me too.
So, another question I have for you is, where do you see this project going? Because for me, it would be really easy to just, like, expand this and be like, oh, I want to apply this model to, you know, identity markers and, like, see what happens next.
Yeah. I think that I want to push it beyond opera as well.
Yeah.
You know, like, I don't think that opera is the only place that this happens where people are championed for their commoditized identity.
Yeah.
I think that it would be really interesting to look at how musical theater pieces are reviewed, how plays are reviewed, how movies are reviewed.
Ooh, that's really interesting. Other art forms.
Yeah, how authors are reviewed. You know, like, we're setting up a model in which we don't need to just, like, we have the possibility of, like, slotting in identity, but we also have the possibility of slotting in genre.
Yeah, that's really cool. I didn't think about that, and that's really exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's what I want to see with this project. Like, I want to create a tool.
Yeah.
In which, or a system in which people can, like, look at the critical reception of of things, of art and culture and literature and whatever. And ask the question, like, are people actually being treated equally?
I feel like we should probably employ a coder to actually get this to be real, so we don't have to sit there and plugging things into Voyant. And don't get me wrong, I love the Voyant owl. I love Voyant. Like, I spend so much time on it because it's really cool. It shows you so much material. But I think if we had time and the funds to do so, or even the time to learn how to code, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe that's an MOC project for down the road. Maybe that's development and production.
Yeah. Maybe. Maybe.
Why were you drawn to this project?
Testing the power of language.
You know, I don't know. It's always, as an opera scholar and as a contemporary opera scholar, you want to go and you want to pay attention to what's happening and what's on the ground. And especially when you're in school and rooted in one place, you can't just go flying across the country to all these other productions. It's really important to pay attention to what these reviews are. Yeah. I can't tell you how many opera conferences I've gone to or listened to opera papers, and they refer to the reviews. They play a really critical role in the reception of music, period.
Yeah.
You know, I think, open a history book and you'll find a review cited somewhere. Because I think they play a big role in deciding what's good and what's not, like it or not.
I think that this also helps us with the frustrating thing in academia, the frustrating thing to me in academia, which is like censorship. Like, or it's not even censorship, it's like anecdotal, it's like, I don't know, there's probably an academic word for what the phenomenon that I'm talking about, but like the trying to explain bias through anecdotes. What is that? Because what I mean is that, like, what we're doing here is we are looking at numbers, like we're looking at statistics, we're looking at, like,
it's concrete,
yeah. It's not, it's quantifiable. It's
objective, it's not subjective.
It's objective, yeah.
But I think this is what's interesting about this project, is it's a combination of the two, right? So we have objective numbers. You can't deny that female is mentioned X amount of times,
right?
That's what comes up. At the same time, there was also a choice to employ a comparison to the Western canon. And there's also a choice to employ a specific.
That's very true. Yeah, comparison. That's very true.
And sometimes, the comparison is does a lot of work, right? Like, if you say Wagnerian brass, you know exactly what that sounds like. Or if you say Puccini melody, you know what that sounds like. But there's also times where comparison is invoked for reasons that I think are a little bit extreme.
Yeah, I totally agree. But I like this study because it has both. And a lot of times I miss the sort of like the quantifiable aspect of academia, especially in these fields, right? Where we're talking about, like, real people's lives and real people's experiences, but, like, you want, like, actual measurable data.
I think sometimes I get frustrated when the people are factored out of studies of culture or studies of art. I'm like, where are the people? These are actually people that created this art and people who are working to put it on and, people who attend.
Yeah.
And I think what's neat about this is you have different layers of interaction with the art. And it's not just we're looking and analyzing one piece of art. It's that we're looking and seeing what public reception is like.
Yeah, totally. Thank you for listening to another episode of Miss Opera Music Mister. If you like what you've heard, please feel free to follow and engage with us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and would love to talk to you about your thoughts about the contemporary opera scene. Be sure to check out all the other incredible projects being incubated with Midnight Oil Collective at this time. And as always, tune in next week to hear about more discussions about the contemporary opera world featuring our favorite opera scholars and composers. The people who are actually doing the thing. Lots of love, y'all.
This podcast episode was produced by Connor O'Toole.
We use this tool called VOYANT Owl. It's an online tool that helps you break down your text into what appears most frequently, as well as the average length, the average article length by words.
Okay, I'm laughing because the tool is called Voyant, but I love the owl, so I just
said
I know, I wanted to put a little shout out to the Voyant owl because he keeps me motivated to keep working. You know, it's like the Duolingo owl that like gets mad at you when you don't come
That's
back.
very funny. I
Sorry, Frances.
thought that I just didn't know what the tool was called. Okay, I'm gonna try that again.